In the frigid waters off Iceland on September 4, 1941, a German U-boat's torpedo streaked through the Atlantic, narrowly missing the USS Greer by mere feet. This close call would prove prophetic. By the time America officially entered World War II 3 months later, the nation faced a terrifying reality. The German Kriegsmarine had already sent hundreds of Allied vessels to the ocean floor, and Japan's Imperial Navy dominated the Pacific with a fleet that had been preparing for war for decades. The United States Navy, still recovering from Pearl Harbor's devastation, needed to accomplish what seemed impossible. They needed to build an entire armada, and they needed to do it faster than any nation had ever constructed ships before. What followed was perhaps the greatest industrial achievement in human history. A shipbuilding marathon that would transform American dockyards into assembly lines of steel and determination, producing vessels at a pace that would eventually overwhelm the Axis powers and change the course of the war. The challenge facing America in late 1941 was nothing short of staggering. At Pearl Harbor, 18 ships had been sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships, the backbone of American naval power. Meanwhile, German U-boats were ravaging Allied shipping in the Atlantic at an alarming rate, sinking vessels far faster than Britain and America could replace them. In 1942 alone, U-boats would send over 1,100 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic, totaling more than 6 million tons of shipping. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, believed he could starve Britain into submission if he could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. For much of 1942, he was succeeding beyond his wildest expectations. In American waters, the carnage was so severe that it became known as the second happy time among German submariners, who found easy prey along the brightly lit American coast. Ships were being torpedoed within sight of beaches where civilians watched in horror as columns of black smoke rose from burning tankers and freighters. The mathematics of maritime warfare were brutally simple. If ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced, the Allies would lose the war. Britain depended entirely on imports for survival. Food, oil, ammunition, aircraft, and raw materials all had to cross the Atlantic. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, needed American supplies delivered through treacherous Arctic convoys. And any American offensive against Japan would require transporting millions of tons of equipment and hundreds of thousands of troops across the world's largest ocean. The United States needed to build ships, and it needed to build them at a rate never before attempted in human history. Traditional shipbuilding methods, where vessels were painstakingly constructed over years by skilled craftsmen, would doom the Allied cause. Something revolutionary had to happen, and it had to happen immediately. Enter Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life, but who would revolutionize naval construction forever. Kaiser was a construction magnate who had made his fortune building roads, bridges, and dams, including the Hoover Dam. He had no experience with ships, no background in naval architecture, and no ties to the traditional shipbuilding establishment. What he did have was an understanding of mass production, an unwavering belief that the impossible was merely difficult, and the audacity to challenge every assumption about how ships should be built. When Kaiser approached the U.S. Maritime Commission with his ideas for revolutionizing ship production, the established shipbuilders scoffed. The Navy brass was skeptical, but desperate times called for desperate measures, and Kaiser was given his chance to prove that American industrial might could overcome German naval superiority. Kaiser's insight was deceptively simple but revolutionary in execution. Instead of building ships the traditional way, constructing them piece by piece in a shipyard from the keel up, he would build them the way Henry Ford built cars, on an assembly line, using prefabricated sections manufactured in factories far from the water. This approach flew in the face of centuries of shipbuilding tradition. Skeptics insisted that ships were too complex, too individual, too demanding of craftsmanship to be mass-produced like automobiles. Kaiser disagreed. He envisions shipyards transformed into massive assembly plants where standardized sections could be welded together with unprecedented speed. The key was welding itself, a relatively new technique that traditional shipbuilders viewed with suspicion. For generations, ships had been riveted together, a time-consuming process requiring highly skilled workers. Welding was faster, required less skill, and created stronger joints, but it was unfamiliar and untested on such massive scale. The ship that would prove Kaiser's methods was the Liberty ship, a no-frills, utilitarian cargo vessel designed by the Maritime Commission to be built quickly and in vast numbers. The Liberty ship was not beautiful. It was not fast, cruising at just 11 knots. It was not particularly maneuverable, and sailors often joked that it handled like a bathtub. But it was simple, sturdy, and most importantly, it could be mass-produced. The design was based on a British tramp steamer, modified and standardized for American production. At 441 feet long and 57 feet wide, each Liberty ship could carry 9,140 tons of cargo, enough to transport 2,800 jeeps, 440 tanks, or enough supplies to sustain an infantry division for months. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called them the ships that won the war, and he wasn't exaggerating. Kaiser and his partners established massive shipyards up and down the American coasts, in Richmond, California, Portland, Oregon, and Savannah, Georgia, among others. These weren't traditional shipyards in any conventional sense. They were industrial complexes on an unprecedented scale, employing revolutionary construction techniques. Rather than building ships from the bottom up, Kaiser's yards built them in massive prefabricated sections. Factories far from the waterfront would produce entire sections of the ship, bow assemblies, stern sections, engine rooms complete with machinery, and transport them to the shipyard for final assembly. This distributed production model meant that work could proceed simultaneously on multiple sections of hundreds of ships, with final assembly happening in parallel rather than sequence. It was mass production applied to objects that weighed 14,000 tons. The transformation of American shipbuilding was nothing short of miraculous. When war broke out, constructing a Liberty ship took roughly 230 days from keel laying to launch. Within months, Kaiser's yards had reduced this to 70 days, then to 45 days. By November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard accomplished what seemed impossible. They constructed the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel to launch. This was a fully functional 10,000-ton cargo ship ready for sea, built faster than most people could build a backyard shed. While the Robert E. Peary was a publicity stunt designed to boost morale and prove what American industry could accomplish, it demonstrated that the impossible had become routine. Kaiser's yards were regularly launching ships in 2 weeks, and eventually they were completing 1 ship every single day. The secret to this extraordinary productivity lay not just in revolutionary techniques, but in revolutionizing the workforce itself. Traditional shipbuilding had been the exclusive domain of highly skilled craftsmen who served long apprenticeships. There simply weren't enough of these skilled workers to build ships at the pace America needed. Kaiser's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Break complex tasks into simple, repeatable operations that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Welding schools were established that could train workers in a matter of weeks rather than years. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Wendy the welder joined Rosie the riveter as iconic figures of American industrial mobilization. By 1943, women made up a significant portion of shipyard workers, performing every job from welding to crane operation to ship fitting. The shipyards operated around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Lighting towers illuminated the yards at night, creating artificial daylight so work never stopped. The scale of operations was staggering. Kaiser's Richmond shipyard alone eventually employed 90,000 workers. The sound was overwhelming. The constant thunder of hammers, the hiss and crackle of welding torches, the screech of cranes lifting massive sections of steel, and the roar of rivet guns. Workers coordinated with hand signals because speech was impossible over the industrial cacophony. Massive gantry cranes, weighing hundreds of tons, moved prefabricated sections into position with surprising precision, lowering multi-story hull sections into place where teams of welders would seal them together. The yards became cities unto themselves, complete with cafeterias, medical facilities, and housing for workers who had flooded into shipbuilding communities from across America. The logistics of supplying these shipyards were themselves a marvel of coordination. Each Liberty ship required 3,500 tons of steel, miles of electrical wiring, hundreds of portholes and hatches, massive steam engines, and thousands of other components. Steel mills worked overtime to provide the raw material. Foundries cast propellers and engine components. Factories produced miles of pipe, electrical systems, and navigation equipment. All of this had to arrive at shipyards in precisely the right sequence to prevent bottlenecks. The entire American industrial base was mobilized in service of ship production, from lumber mills providing wooden decking to textile factories weaving canvas for hatch covers. It was a symphony of industrial coordination conducted on a continental scale. But Liberty ships were just the beginning. As American industry hit its stride, production expanded to include fleet oilers, attack transports, destroyer escorts, and eventually larger warships. The Navy needed escorts to protect convoys from U-boat attack, and traditional destroyers took too long to build. The solution was the destroyer escort. Smaller, simpler, and less capable than a full destroyer, but adequate for anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection. These too could be mass-produced using prefabrication techniques. Kaiser even proposed building aircraft carriers using his assembly line methods, an idea that seemed preposterous to Navy traditionalists. Yet by 1943, Kaiser's yards were launching escort carriers, smaller, simpler carriers built on merchant ship hulls that could be produced in a fraction of the time required for fleet carriers. These jeep carriers proved invaluable in protecting convoys and supporting amphibious operations. The impact on the war was transformative. German Admiral Dönitz watched in growing horror as his U-boat campaign faltered against the rising tide of American production. He had calculated that sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced would win the war. But Kaiser's yards were launching ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In 1943, the United States alone launched 19 million tons of merchant shipping, 3 times what the U-boats sank that year. The arithmetic of attrition had reversed. Every Liberty ship sunk was replaced by 3 more. U-boat crews who had enjoyed a turkey shoot in 1942 now found themselves hunted by increasing numbers of destroyers and aircraft operating from escort carriers. The Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively in the Allies' favor, not because of any single tactical innovation, but because American shipyards had simply overwhelmed German submarines through sheer productive capacity. In the Pacific, American ship production enabled an island-hopping campaign that would have been impossible otherwise. Every amphibious operation required an armada of transports, cargo ships, landing craft, escorts, and support vessels. The invasion of Okinawa alone involved over 1,500 ships. American shipyards provided this massive fleet while simultaneously replacing combat losses and maintaining supply lines stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. Japanese leaders, watching American fleets grow larger despite their success in sinking ships, realized they were fighting an enemy that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. A Japanese officer grimly noted that America was building ships like they were making automobiles. He was correct. That was exactly how America was building them. The statistics of American ship production during World War II remain staggering even decades later. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 2,751 Liberty ships alone. They built another 414 similar Victory ships, a faster and more capable design introduced late in the war. In total, American yards launched approximately 5,500 merchant vessels and auxiliary ships, totaling over 56 million deadweight tons. This doesn't even include warships. The Navy commissioned hundreds of destroyers, destroyer escorts, submarines, cruisers, battleships, and carriers during the same period. At the peak of production in 1943, American shipyards were completing a new vessel every 8 hours. It was an achievement of industrial mobilization that has never been matched. The human cost and sacrifice behind these statistics deserves recognition. Shipyard work was dangerous. Workers operated massive machinery in cramped conditions, often at heights or in confined spaces aboard partially completed ships. Welders worked with equipment that could cause severe burns or electrocution. Crane operators moved loads weighing dozens of tons above crowded decks where hundreds of workers swarmed like ants. Accidents were common. Workers fell from scaffolding, were struck by swinging loads, or were caught in machinery. Yet they continued working, motivated by patriotism, economic necessity, and the knowledge that every ship they completed might save Allied lives and help bring the war to a speedier conclusion. The Liberty ships themselves, despite being built with unprecedented speed, generally proved remarkably seaworthy and reliable. They served not just during the war, but for decades afterward. Some remained in service into the 1970s, a testament to their rugged construction. However, there were problems. Early Liberty ships suffered from catastrophic hull fractures. Several ships literally broke in half in heavy seas. Investigations revealed that welding, while faster than riveting, could create stress points where cracks could propagate across the hull. Once this was understood, modifications to the design and welding techniques largely solved the problem. But these early failures demonstrated that Kaiser's mass production techniques, while revolutionary, required constant refinement and quality control. The legacy of America's wartime shipbuilding extends far beyond military victory. The techniques pioneered by Kaiser and others transformed the entire shipbuilding industry. Welding replaced riveting as the standard construction method. Prefabrication and modular construction became industry norms. The concept of standardized designs enabling mass production influenced post-war commercial shipbuilding worldwide. Perhaps more significantly, the organizational methods and management techniques developed to coordinate production on such a massive scale influenced the entire American industrial base. The lessons learned in shipyards found application in aerospace, automotive, and construction industries. Kaiser himself became a national hero, his face appearing on magazine covers and newsreels. After the war, he leveraged his fame and expertise to establish successful businesses in steel, aluminum, cement, and eventually healthcare, founding Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest health maintenance organizations. But his greatest achievement remained those wartime shipyards, where the impossible became routine, where ships rose from steel plates to finished vessels in days rather than years, where ordinary Americans with minimal training accomplished extraordinary feats of production. The workers who built this armada came from every background imaginable. They were farmers who had never seen the ocean, housewives who had never held a welding torch, teenagers barely out of high school, and retirees who came out of retirement to serve the war effort. They were black workers who found opportunities in shipyards that had been denied them in peacetime, though they still faced discrimination and segregation in many yards. They were Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and recent immigrants who seized the chance to prove their patriotism and contribute to victory. Together, this unlikely workforce accomplished what experts had declared impossible. In the end, the shipbuilders' marathon proved decisive to Allied victory in World War II. The ships built in American yards during those frantic years carried the supplies that sustained Britain, the equipment that armed the Soviet Union, the troops that liberated Europe, and the forces that conquered the Pacific. They transported the aircraft, tanks, ammunition, fuel, and food that made victory possible. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, American-built ships clogged European harbors. When Japan surrendered 3 months later, American vessels filled Pacific anchorages from Sydney to Okinawa. The United States had built a fleet that spanned 2 oceans and made Allied victory not just possible, but inevitable.
Standing in one of Kaiser's shipyards at the height of production must have been an overwhelming experience. The scale, the noise, the coordinated chaos of thousands of workers swarming over dozens of ships in various stages of completion, the cranes swinging massive sections into place, the showers of sparks from countless welding torches, and the knowledge that every 8 hours another vessel would slide down the ways into the water. It was American industrial power made visible and tangible. It was democracy's arsenal in action, proof that free people working together could outproduce, outbuild, and ultimately outlast any totalitarian regime, no matter how militaristic or prepared for war. The Shipbuilders Marathon stands as one of history's great industrial achievements, a testament to American ingenuity, determination, and the power of free enterprise mobilized for a common purpose. In those desperate years when civilization hung in the balance, American shipyards became the arsenal of democracy, producing the steel fleet that carried freedom across 2 oceans. The Liberty ships and their crews didn't win World War II alone, but without them, victory would have been impossible. They were, as Churchill said, the ships that won the war, and the men and women who built them in record time were the unsung heroes who made the Allied triumph possible. Their achievement reminds us that when challenged, free people working together can accomplish the impossible. They can build a fleet in months, turn the tide of global conflict, and write history with steel, sweat, and unshakable determination. The stories of individual ships and the people who built them add human dimension to these staggering statistics. Consider the SS Stephen Hopkins, a Liberty ship that encountered the German raider Stier and her escort Tannenfels in the South Atlantic in September 1942. Outgunned and outmatched, the Hopkins fought back with her single obsolete deck gun. The engagement lasted 20 minutes and ended with the Hopkins sinking, but not before her crew managed to damage the Stiers so severely that the German raider had to be scuttled. It was the only American merchant ship to sink a German warship in a surface engagement during the entire war. The Hopkins and her heroic crew demonstrated that these quickly built vessels, crewed by ordinary merchant mariners, could stand and fight even against purpose-built warships. Or consider the story of the SS Richard Montgomery, one of the thousands of Liberty ships that survived the war, or rather, almost survived. In August 1944, the Montgomery ran aground in the Thames estuary with a cargo of nearly 7,000 tons of explosives. Salvage attempts were abandoned, and the ship remains there to this day, her masts still visible above the water, a time bomb sitting in one of the world's busiest shipping channels. The Montgomery serves as a reminder that the urgency of wartime production sometimes meant ships went to sea carrying cargoes and sailing into waters that in peacetime would have demanded far more caution. She also reminds us that the legacy of the Shipbuilders Marathon extends into the present. Engineers still monitor the slowly deteriorating wreck, aware that if her cargo explodes, it could be one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history.
The experiences of the men and women who worked in the shipyards reveal a complex picture of wartime America. For many women, shipyard work represented unprecedented opportunity and autonomy. They earned wages far higher than traditional women's work paid, learned skills that gave them confidence and capability, and proved themselves equal to tasks society had insisted only men could perform. Photographs from the era show women wielding welding torches, operating cranes, and reading blueprints with the same competence as their male colleagues. Yet this progress came with resistance. Many male workers resented female colleagues. Supervisors often relegated women to less skilled positions regardless of their abilities. And unions sometimes fought to exclude women from certain jobs. Nevertheless, women proved essential to shipyard operations, and their contributions helped change American attitudes about women's capabilities. African American workers faced similar contradictions. The desperate need for labor opened shipyard jobs that had been closed to black workers before the war. Thousands of African Americans migrated from the South to shipbuilding centers in California, Oregon, and other states, seeking both economic opportunity and escape from Jim Crow segregation. They found better wages than they had ever known, but also encountered discrimination, segregated facilities, and resistance from white workers. Some shipyards maintained separate work crews and facilities for black and white workers. Race riots erupted in some shipbuilding communities as white residents resisted the influx of black workers and their families. Yet despite these obstacles, black workers made crucial contributions to ship production, and their wartime experiences contributed to the civil rights movement that would gather strength in the post-war years. The shipyards also transformed entire communities almost overnight. Richmond, California exemplifies this transformation. Before the war, Richmond was a small town of about 24,000 people. Kaiser's shipyard brought an influx of workers that swelled the population to over 100,000 by 1943. Housing couldn't keep up with demand. Workers lived in tent cities, trailer parks, and quickly erected temporary housing projects. Schools were overwhelmed. Infrastructure groaned under the sudden population surge. Similar scenes played out in Portland, Savannah, and other shipbuilding centers. These boom towns brought together people from vastly different backgrounds: rural farmers and urban workers, northerners and southerners, native-born Americans and recent immigrants. The resulting cultural collision was sometimes creative, sometimes contentious, but always transformative. Kaiser understood that productive workers needed more than just jobs. They needed childcare, healthcare, housing, and community. His shipyards pioneered industrial childcare centers, where mothers could leave their children while they worked their shifts. These facilities opened 24 hours to accommodate shift work, provided meals, medical care, and education. Kaiser also established healthcare facilities that would eventually evolve into Kaiser Permanente. He built housing projects and worked to create communities rather than just industrial facilities. While these efforts were partly pragmatic, happy, healthy workers were more productive, they also reflected a philosophy that business had obligations to workers beyond just wages. These innovations influenced post-war thinking about corporate responsibility and employee welfare. The technical innovations developed in wartime shipyards extended beyond construction techniques to include quality control and inspection methods that were revolutionary for their time. Inspectors used new technologies like X-ray examination of welds to detect hidden flaws. Statistical quality control methods, pioneered in other industries, were adapted to shipbuilding to identify problems before they caused catastrophic failures. After the early hull fracture disasters, engineers developed better understanding of metallurgy and stress concentration, leading to design modifications that made subsequent ships more reliable. These quality control innovations, born of wartime necessity, became standard practice across American industry in the post-war era. The Allied victory in the Atlantic deserves particular attention because it was so directly dependent on American shipbuilding. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. If the Atlantic lifeline had been severed, Britain would have starved, the Soviet Union would have lacked equipment to resist Nazi Germany, and American armies would never have reached European shores. The battle was decided not primarily by tactical innovations or code-breaking, important as those were, but by American industry's ability to build ships faster than U-boats could sink them. By 1943, new ships were entering service faster than Germany could build submarines. Convoy escort vessels became so numerous that U-boats found it increasingly difficult to attack successfully. The mathematical equation that Admiral Donitz had counted on, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, reversed against him. Liberty ships became so numerous that sinking them individually became pointless. The Pacific Campaign required even more impressive logistical feats. Consider Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. This single operation required more ships than any other amphibious operation in history. Over 1,500 vessels, ranging from battleships and aircraft carriers to humble liberty ships and transports. These ships carried 183,000 troops, their equipment, supplies, and ammunition. They provided fire support, transported reinforcements and supplies throughout the 3-month battle, evacuated wounded, and maintained the supply line back to bases thousands of miles away. Without American shipyards working at full capacity for years beforehand, assembling such an armada would have been inconceivable. Every major Pacific operation, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Leyte Gulf, depended absolutely on the availability of transport and supply vessels that could only come from American shipyards. The atomic bomb gets credit for ending the Pacific War, but logisticians know that Japan was already being strangled by American naval power. By mid-1945, American submarines and surface ships had virtually annihilated Japanese merchant shipping. Japan's empire, built on capturing resource-rich territories, could no longer transport those resources to the home islands. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials. Cities went dark for lack of fuel. The Japanese people faced starvation. This economic strangulation was only possible because American shipyards had produced enough submarines, destroyers, and cruisers to impose an effective blockade across thousands of miles of ocean. The ships built in Richmond, Portland, and Savannah patrolled Japanese waters, sank Japanese merchant vessels, and gradually choked off the island nation's ability to continue fighting. As the war drew to a close, the question arose of what to do with this enormous merchant fleet. Thousands of Liberty ships suddenly found themselves without a wartime mission. Some were sold to foreign shipping lines, helping rebuild global maritime commerce. Others went into the National Defense Reserve Fleet, anchored in quiet bays and rivers as a strategic reserve for future emergencies. Some of these mothballed ships remained in reserve for decades, occasionally reactivated for conflicts like the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Others were scrapped, their steel recycled for peacetime purposes. A handful were converted for specialized uses. Some became floating storage facilities, others became breakwaters, and at least one became a museum ship, preserved as a memorial to the merchant marine and the shipyard workers who made victory possible. The economic impact of wartime shipbuilding rippled through American society for decades. The shipyards trained hundreds of thousands of workers in industrial skills that translated to peacetime employment in manufacturing, construction, and other industries. The management techniques and organizational methods developed to coordinate massive production efforts influenced American business practices throughout the post-war boom. The infrastructure created to support shipbuilding, steel mills, fabrication facilities, transportation networks, formed the foundation for post-war industrial expansion. Communities that had been small towns before the war remained significant population centers afterward, their growth permanently altered by the wartime boom. Kaiser and other shipbuilders demonstrated that American capitalism, properly mobilized and motivated, could achieve results that matched or exceeded any state-directed economy. Soviet propagandists might boast about 5-year plans and socialist efficiency, but no socialist economy ever matched what American shipyards accomplished between 1941 and 1945. Nazi Germany, despite its vaunted industrial might and regimented economy, never approached American productivity. Japan's military-dominated industrial system, supposedly optimized for war production, was buried under the output of American workers who had been building civilian goods just months before. The lesson was clear. Free enterprise, properly motivated and coordinated, could mobilize resources and produce results that totalitarian systems could not match. Yet it's important to acknowledge that this achievement was not purely the result of free market forces. Government played a crucial role through the Maritime Commission, which designed the ships, allocated resources, provided financing, and coordinated production. The War Production Board directed raw materials to priority industries.
The government guaranteed contracts and absorbed financial risks that private companies would not have undertaken. What made American wartime production so successful was the partnership between government direction and private enterprise efficiency. Neither pure socialism nor pure capitalism, but a pragmatic hybrid that leveraged the strengths of both systems.
The human cost of merchant shipping deserves recognition alongside the achievement of building the ships. More than 9,000 American merchant mariners died during World War II, killed by torpedoes, bombs, storms, and combat. The merchant marine had a higher casualty rate than any military service except the Marine Corps. These men went to sea knowing the dangers, but sailed anyway because the war effort depended on them. They manned the Liberty ships and tankers and transports that carried the material of war through submarine-infested waters. They fought fires aboard torpedoed ships, abandoned vessels in icy waters, and endured weeks in lifeboats after sinkings. Some were captured and spent years in prisoner-of-war camps. They were civilians, not soldiers, yet they faced combat conditions throughout the war. Their courage and sacrifice matched that of any military unit, yet they received little recognition for decades after the war ended. The story of the Shipbuilders Marathon also highlights the importance of leadership and vision. Henry Kaiser was not a technical expert or a naval architect. His contribution was not detailed engineering knowledge, but rather the vision to see that shipbuilding could be revolutionized, the courage to challenge established methods, and the leadership to inspire thousands of workers to accomplish unprecedented feats. His optimism was contagious. He convinced workers that they could build a ship in days, convinced officials that mass production could work for vessels weighing thousands of tons, and convinced a skeptical industry that a newcomer could teach them better methods. This kind of transformational leadership, willing to challenge assumptions and imagine new possibilities, proved as important as any technical innovation. The maritime victory also depended on countless smaller innovations and adaptations. Engineers developed better welding electrodes and techniques. Designers modified ship plans to eliminate bottlenecks and simplify construction. Workers invented tools and methods to speed specific tasks. Supervisors experimented with different ways to organize labor and coordinate work crews. Each improvement might save only minutes or hours, but multiplied across thousands of ships, these incremental gains added up to revolutionary results. This culture of continuous improvement, where workers at every level sought ways to work faster and better, exemplified American pragmatism and ingenuity. It wasn't a single brilliant innovation that won the Shipbuilders Marathon. It was thousands of small improvements, each contributing to the larger achievement. Looking back across 8 decades, the Shipbuilders Marathon of World War II stands as a defining moment in American history. It demonstrated that American democracy, when challenged, could mobilize resources and coordinate efforts on a scale that matched or exceeded any authoritarian regime. It showed that ordinary Americans, given opportunity and purpose, could accomplish extraordinary things. It proved that innovation and pragmatism could overcome established methods and conventional wisdom. Most importantly, it demonstrated that industrial capacity could be as decisive as military prowess, that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and workshops, where ordinary people turn raw materials into the instruments of victory. The ships that won the war were built by people who had never built ships before, using methods that experts said wouldn't work, at a pace that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. They were welded together by housewives and farmers, launched by teenagers and grandmothers, and sent to sea carrying the hopes of free peoples around the world. They were ugly and slow and uncomfortable, but they were built with skill and care by workers who understood that every rivet, every weld, and every fitting might mean the difference between victory and defeat. In American shipyards during World War II, the impossible became routine, and ordinary Americans became heroes of the industrial age, proving that determination, ingenuity, and hard work could change the course of history and preserve freedom for future generations.